urban battles, this is a war with many battles in it, the question of what is your civilian to combatant ratio has never been asked of another nation. One is the ideal that you could even have a number, but it's actually effects-based assessments because political leaders, UN groups, media want to make the number as big as they can and then delegitimize and demonize Israel based on nothing that happened, but that's the number. So I think the double standard is the casualty counting, which isn't a requirement in the law of war anywhere. It's never quantitative. Real-time casualty counting, double standard. There's never been an urban battle, let alone a war, where you would know what the civilian casualty count, if you had to count, is on a day-to-day basis. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One story, in 1945, the Allies decided to bomb Dresden. Immediately after the bombing, no other than Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda put out that 250,000 civilians were killed. For an entire Western media ran with that number, and for over 50 years, that was the number. And then in 1994, a group of historians went in and for 10 years worked on that number, and the true reality is it's 20 to 25,000. I've never studied a battle. I can fast forward. As I go and write case studies, I'm always looking for the numbers because people like numbers. How many forces were involved on one side, the other side, what was the result of the battle? So 1945 Battle of Manila, there are 17,000 defending Japanese, there are 4,000 American, British, and other internees. There's 100,000 civilians killed. I never had to say, what's the ratio until this war, and go back and go, well, that's a 6-to-1 ratio. Like, John, but that was World War II, even though there was no bombing in that. Well, how about the Korean War? The Korean War, there are many urban battles. Nobody's trying to report on a day-to-day basis what is the civilian casualty count, and then say, you're doing something illegal. There are 2 million civilians that died during the Korean War. That's 54,000 civilians a month for 37 months. That isn't the term, that's awful. War is awful. So everybody goes, okay, let's fast forward to anything similar. Well, there's nothing similar in Gaza, but there seems to be something very unique that somebody within Gaza can count the casualties on a day-to-day basis and give you a number to the single digit, and the world believes it and runs with it. So then they try to compare it to the Battle of Mosul, right? The Battle of Mosul is the biggest urban battle since World War II, and I followed it very closely, and there's nobody saying on a day-to-day basis how many civilians were dying. Matter of fact, a year after the battle, they still didn't know how many civilians were dying. Interestingly, just this week, the Gaza Health Ministry has a new number that they have validated 2 years later. Okay, fine, but that still doesn't mean anybody did anything illegal. And then there's also the double standard of aggregating the data and disaggregating the data. So I'll take all the deaths, no matter what happened, and just give you the biggest number and say, okay, and I'm going to compare that against something small in history. The civilian to combatant ratio, I can't get people to, that's a new standard as well. Like, no, it's civilian versus, it's non-combatant versus combatant. I just told you the number of civilians that died in the Battle of Mosul, 10,000. I know that there are 5,000 defenders, so then we'll do the 2-to-1. Everybody wants to do the numbers game. I want people to get out of the numbers game. That's not the way the law of war works. What you actually have to do as a military taking the action, you have to assess your target is legitimate, assess the civilian casualties that will happen, and ensure it's not excessive to the value of the target. And then, what have you done to prevent the civilians? And this is my other standard, and I don't want to go over my time, that there's a standard of civilian harm mitigation, which is actually in the law of war, which in proportionality says you have to take all feasible precautions to prevent civilian harm. That has been translated by human rights activists into what militaries must do. What is the standard? So for this war, Israel employed every standard that had ever been tried, attempted. Dropping of flyers, phone calls, all of this. Those are called civilian harm mitigation measures. That's a double standard to say, look, you need to try everything that's ever been used, despite the context, in this war, which the context of the war absolutely matters, and the law of war accounts for that in feasible precautions, the precaution law.